We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and joining me once again is Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is the host of Economic Update Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV. He has many other accomplishments, which I won't list because he comes on the program often. We're always delighted to have him. He's an economist and a historian, among other things. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Very glad to be here.
So here's what I wanted to do today. It may seem counterintuitive as we're dealing with what seem to me crises of the capitalist system now, as the U.S. freezes the assets of other countries and so on, and as the global financial system shows its claws or its talons in various ways. But I want to go back to basics, if you don't mind, and I want to talk about what it really means to be, for example, an anti-capitalist. I'll give you a prosaic example to start with. Maybe from the prosaic, we can go to the bigger issues. I have a relative who might say he's a capitalist. Why? Because he owns a series of vending machines and actually has very good left reviews, but this is a hypothetical. He owns a series of vending machines. He invested in them. He started making a little money at it, hired a guy to help him repair them and so on. A lot of people would look at my relative and say, that guy is a capitalist. And a lot of people in that position would say, I'm a capitalist. But when we talk about the capitalist system, I don't think that's what we're talking about, are we?
Well, it is not a settled matter. So the first thing is, in a way, to congratulate you for putting out explicitly that question, which should be answered, if we're honest, by saying people don't agree on what capitalism exactly is, and they never have. And that's not bad, because if you look closely at most of the important things in life, people disagree over them, whether it's politics or religion or sexuality or whatever it is. People have different ways of understanding it. So let me tell you how I understand it, and we can kind of work from there. Capital literally means the use of money to make more money.
Right.
That is the old basic definition. So, for example, if I lend you $100 on condition that 1 year from now you will give me back not just the 100 I gave you, but an additional $5, so that you give me back 105. I have used my money in such a way that the money becomes capital. Why? Because it brought back more than itself. I used the money in a way to make more money. If I had simply lent you the $100 and you had to give it back to me, there would be no capital, because the money in being loaned didn't generate an excess, a greater amount, or if you like, a surplus, which is where the idea comes from. Here's another example. If I'm a storekeeper, a merchant, I buy a package of potato chips and I pay 75 cents and I put them out in my store and I charge you $1. I have used 75 cents to purchase something that I sell at a higher price. I keep the difference, but I'm a capitalist because I've used my money in a way to make more money. In the first example, I did it by lending at interest. And in the second example, I did it by buying and then reselling at a higher price. Now comes the third one. There's another way, beside those two, which are very old. They've existed for thousands of years. But there's a new way. And that's when you use money to go into production, not borrowing and lending, not buying and reselling, but the production by means of labor and inputs of a new and different output, which you sell. That is what we mean by capitalism in its modern form, because it has become the basis of the economy. In slavery, it doesn't work like that. In feudalism, it doesn't work like that. That's capital took over production long after it was common in lending and it was common in merchanting. But to go into production meant you had to have something that you could buy that would somehow become more than what it is you paid for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be capital. So the way this works, and the man who figured this out, the clearest and the best, was this fellow named Karl Marx. I mean, there's just no way around it. He's the guy. So he explained, in production, you buy inputs. Let's say you spend $100 to buy tools, equipment, raw materials, machines, all of that. And you spend another $100 to hire workers. Okay, the $100 used up in the tools, equipment, and raw materials is transferred to the value of the product. You've used them up. They're now in a different form. Instead of having a piece of wood, you have the finished product, a chair. Right. Okay, and likewise, you've paid the workers, so their labor has transformed the nails, the glue, the wood into the final chair. And then Marx said, okay, where does the growth come? How is it possible that the chair is worth more than the money the capitalist put in to buying the inputs and the labor? That was the conundrum. How do you? And he answered the question. The worker to whom you pay adds more value by his or her labor than you pay them. In other words, and now let me translate it into simple everyday English that everyone watching this program can understand. If you go and sit down with an employer, which many of us have done umpteen times, and you discuss a job you want to get, and you then reach a certain point, and you and the employer agree, I'm going to pay you $20 per hour. You know, even if you couldn't put it into words, what Marx figured out, and I'm now going to tell you, that the only way any employer will ever give you $20 an hour is if, and only if, during that hour, you produce more for that capitalist employer to sell than $20 worth. Because if you didn't, if he only got an extra 20 for every hour you worked, and he had to pay that 20 to you, there'd be nothing in it for him. He wouldn't stay in that line of work. He will find a way to invest his capital in a production arrangement where the worker always produces more than it costs the employer to get him to come to work, which is why, footnote, those people watching or listening to this program who have ever ended a workday feeling vaguely ripped off should congratulate themselves. They were right. They should feel that way because in capitalism, the condition for you to have a job is that you produce more value while you're working than your employer pays you. Not because he's not a nice guy, not because he's greedy, but because that's the way the system works, and that's the only way that capitalist employer will survive.
Let me ask you, Richard Wolff, and by the way, I think this is really important because I think that the way we see the world from the smallest economic unit to the largest, but particularly in this society, is infused with these conceptions and misconceptions about what these terms mean. So let me give you another example from my family. I just have an economically illustrative family. I'm sorry, but all I knew about my grandfather's early days was that my father was very proud. He was a union leader, and he was quoted in the New York Times in the 1920s or 30s. So I looked up the quote, and I found it. He wasn't the typical union leader. He was a tailor. He had a little one-man tailor shop. You know, he did everything a tailor does. I still remember the smell of the steam press in that shop. It's one of my earliest memories. And he was a leader of a union, but it was a union more like a medieval guild of independent tailors like himself. And he was quoted in the New York Times because they were objecting to corporate mass production type shops that were coming in. They were not in Manhattan. They were in, far-flung provinces like Brooklyn. And they were doing these things en masse that he and his peers were doing in their individual little shops, and they objected to it. This was not the way it was supposed to be. Now, I assume that my grandfather would pay, 2 cents for a button and sell it for a nickel when he had to replace a button or what have you, a yard of fabric, what have you. But I wouldn't say that he was a capitalist. I know in his own beliefs he was a socialist. He was one of those readers of the Jewish Daily Forward and all that. You're just speaking socialist. But people today might look at them and say, yeah, he's a small businessman. He's a capitalist, and sort of lump him in the same category with the CEO of Bank of America. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yes. But I mean, that's why I was careful with the definition. A capitalist has to have an employee. Otherwise, we're in a different economic system. Self-employment has existed for thousands of years. Individuals working by themselves. The biggest example, of course, in the world is the farmer, the peasant, the person who plows the land or raises the animals and works by himself or herself, maybe as a partner with a spouse together. But if you don't have an employee, someone who adds more labor than you pay them, then you're not a capitalist by the classic standard definitions. But of course, since people want to use these words in lots of ways, let me explain your grandfather to you from the classic example. When the big capitalists come in, when they figure out that if they buy big machines and they hire armies of employees, they can produce output that is cheaper than the individual tailor making each dress or each suit by themselves, then they worry about people like your grandfather, that the individuals will say, well, when you do it that way, you don't treat people very well, you don't produce very good quality, it doesn't last, much of which is true, and they fight. Now, the big guys have to worry because there's an awful lot of these little tailors. They're scattered all over the community. Everybody knows them because they've gone there to have their pants fixed or their shirt adjusted. And so this could become an obstacle to their being able to work. So you got to neutralize them politically. And one of the ways you do that is, oh, no, we are not adversaries. We are all together capitalists.
Right.
This is a way to get them, for example, to join your organization of clothing persons or however you call it. And then you hope to win them over slowly, buy some of them out. Look, if you don't oppose us anymore, we'll buy your little shop, give you twice what it's worth. But then you become an advocate of us all being together. And that's how these fights are worked out. And you play with the definitions. You play with the definitions to do that. To use a modern example, the United States, as a result of this Ukraine war, the United States seized the private property of large numbers of very wealthy people in Russia. Okay, I'm not even going to talk about what it means for a government in what considers itself to be a private property worshiping society, having just blithely obliterated the private property of a whole group of human beings. I mean, it's extraordinary. And it'll come back to haunt this country in ways that we could someday talk about. But here's an irony you should enjoy. All the Russian so-called wealthy people, demonized by calling them oligarchs, spent the last 20, 30 years making a ton of money inside Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, But being cautious, wealthy people, they did what cautious, wealthy people around the world have always done: diversified their risk by keeping some of that money in New York, and some of that money in Paris, and some of that money in Tokyo, and some of that money home. Now that the United States has shown that it isn't a safe place to put it, they're all bringing their money back into Russia and investing it in Russia, which is very good for the Russian economy and not good for the United States and France and Japan, which is not only losing the money of the Russian oligarchs, but of course the wealthy in every other country, whether you call them oligarchs or not, are figuring out, what happens if my country comes on the wrong end of the United States? Unless you think, that's not going to happen, let me give you an example of a country to whom it is happening as I speak to you: India, which has a whole bunch of millionaires who keep their money in New York, but who are watching the United States vent its anger that India is siding with Russia, not Ukraine, in this war, by making noises about Ukraine, about India, and making Indian wealthy people begin to pull their wealth out of anywhere that the United States can get them. The long-term implications of this, very, very dangerous for the United States. And my guess is future leaders of this country will be very critical of Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden for having demonized and punished through these mechanisms wealthy people abroad, because those wealthy people are moving their wealth out of the U.S. and they're not going to bring it back anytime soon.
Well, a couple of things I want to ask you about. One is, when they started seizing, quote unquote, Russian oligarchs' wealth, I wrote a piece saying, as long as you're seizing oligarchs' wealth, I have a few suggestions for you here in the United States. You could go after these guys. But it seems to me, number one definition of a capitalist, for example, would be someone whose wealth can be seized in that way. Grandpa Joe Eskow didn't have anything in overseas bank accounts, and I think most of us do not. But in terms of the issue you raised of the U.S. using its banking power, its global banking power, to seize the wealth of so-called oligarchs and others, of course, it's also seized the wealth of Afghanistan, the national, that amount of money, that whatever it is, 8 or 9 billion that's been parked in U.S. institutions. It's seizing it now. Joe Biden says he's going to distribute it as he pleases, not as the Afghans please. And it seems to me that the long-term implications of this are, we are, and I think this is what you're saying, but we are abdicating our position as the kind of global wealth hub of the. If we start to do this, people will no longer consider us the global wealth hub. B, this has profound implications for the future. And C, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, at least from one perspective, maybe that ain't such a bad thing. So that's 3 things. I'm sorry, I threw a lot at you, but I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I not only agree with you, but I would take it even a step further. I think the United States has already lost its position, and that these behaviors are the behavior, there's no other way to say this, of a loser. I mean, the world parked its money. The wealthy of the world, the governments of the world, parked their money in the US dollar, deposited it in the United States or elsewhere in the form of dollar deposits, because the dollar was the global currency. It was the safest, securest way. You always needed a dollar because the US is the dominant player in the world economy, the major player in global trade. Well, that's not true anymore. The Chinese are a much bigger player in world trade than the United States, about twice the percentage of global trade is undertaken with China than with the United States. So what the United States is doing, I fear for them, is accelerate the end of the dollar, the end of the United States. It was already shrinking. That's why China and Russia are in part allied. That's why many countries around the world are scratching their head and wondering which is the better bet for them, ally with the United States and Western Europe and a little bit Japan, or with the rising China, Russia, Iran, India, Brazil, all of that. Americans haven't wanted to face it or look at it or take it seriously, but they better. Let me give you an example. About a week ago, there was a vote in the General Assembly, which got some coverage in American media, and it voted to remove Russia from the seat it had on something called the Human Rights Council, okay? And this was reported because it was the kind of news American media liked. Russia was slapped and was, criticized. Okay, so I did the job that a journalist should do. I went to the UN and I looked up what happened. Okay. Here we go. The General Assembly has 193 members. That is, there's 193 countries, each of which has a delegation that sits in the General Assembly. Okay, keep that number 193 in your mind. How many countries voted to remove Russia from the Human Rights Council? Answer, 93 votes. Okay, that's a minority of 193. Pretty significant minority. Then I went to say, well, how does that work out? 24 countries voted against removing Russia. 58 voted to abstain, and the others didn't bother to vote at all. However, among the countries that voted against this resolution were Russia, obviously, which is the largest country on this planet in terms of geography. China, which is the largest country on this planet in terms of population. And India, which is the second largest country in terms of population. They all were against doing this. And I'm not even mentioning the dozens and dozens and dozens of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America who did not want to do this. For this to be represented in the United States media as a great victory is really wild, because forget that it's not honest. That's the least of it. It tells you that the level of hysteria and of hype going on is now wild. It's beyond cheerleading. It's becoming literally hysterical. When I read, I couldn't believe it the other day, that President Biden referred to what's happening in Ukraine as quote unquote genocide.
Right. Okay.
I did my homework again. According to the United Nations, as of 2 days ago, 1,892 civilians have been killed in Ukraine. That is horrible, should never have happened. But let's keep a brain now. 50 days of war, under 2,000 dead people. The United States just recently ended an invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. It didn't last 50 days, it lasted 20 years, and it killed tens of thousands of people by all estimates. Mr. Biden never refers to that as a genocide, but the one in Ukraine is a genocide. What he's doing is so abusing language that he faces the risk that that's going to come back to haunt him. It's the old joke about the child who calls Wolff too many times. You keep doing that, and then the time comes when you really have it, no one will believe you anymore because you used it in the most irresponsible way, and that can have devastating consequences later. These are the behaviors of a country that's already, in a sense, skidding down. and is grabbing on whatever it can to hold on, which isn't going to work because the process is too far along. And what you hear from Washington is an endless bleating of overdone, overheated rhetoric because they really can't do anything about what the real issues here are. Ukraine is a pawn. It's a declining American empire and a rising Chinese empire. The whole world sees that. I read European newspapers every day. It's part of my job. Even in Europe, which is mostly allied with the United States, they still see that they are maybe, and by the way, I'm quoting now, betting on the wrong horse. Oh, right? They at least see that they might be doing that. In the third world, the so-called global south, that is an explicit conversation. Here in the United States, there's the make-believe that none of these conversations are going on. Very strange. Very strange.
And it seems to me, Richard Wolff, that a lot of the current, your quote of Biden is an example of this. A lot of our current dialogue about Russia and Ukraine is very reminiscent to the Islamophobic rhetoric we were hearing 20 years ago, that not only of course, 9/11 was a horrific, but that somehow Islamic fundamentalists represented an existential threat to the United States and needed to be exterminated at any cost to the civilian populations there. Now we're not hearing that anymore. Now we're hearing it about Russia, whereas the only real existential threat Russia poses to it is through its nuclear weapons, right. And yet the dialogue is not about reducing or eliminating those weapons, but about accelerating, entering into new areas of the arms race, hypersonic missiles, whatever, at a time that our primary concern should be de-escalating those risks and those tensions. And doesn't this all, I mean, in an odd way, I think people are even trying to fit the anti-capitalist rhetoric into this, even though Russia is a capitalist country, largely are doing. I still hear people refer to them as the Soviets, the Reds, the communists. Yes. The Donna Brazil, a leading Democratic commentator, blocked me because she referred to, years ago, to Putin and the Russians as communists. And I said, gee, Donna, on Twitter, they're not communists. You might want to clarify that. And her response was to block me. Right. So I think there's a whole, we're still using this totemic definition of, if they hate communism, they hate our freedoms. If they hate our freedoms, we must destroy them. Am I reading too much into it?
No, I would take your argument a bit further. I have been brought to believe that the whole 20th century rhetoric about a war between socialism and capitalism, that wasn't the issue. It was the issue of the American empire did not want to brook any opposition anywhere. When Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, who was no leftist, no Marxist, no nothing, when he wanted to seize the oil under the ground of Persia, of Iran there, then he was demonized and he was overthrown. Anybody in the world who objected. That's why today, even though Russia has nothing to do with socialism and communism, has a leadership that is proud of that fact, it doesn't matter. And that's why the people get confused, because they never paid all that much attention to the details, because it was important to have the clarity that whatever aggrandized the American capitalist empire was positive, democracy, and everything that was against it was evil and awful. And if the language of evil and awful was socialism, use that. If that made no sense, find something else. So Mr. Putin has to be, in the main, denounced for every other crime we can think of, genocide, war crime. I mean, it is stunning. 2,000 people, civilians, have died, and we're ready to go to have the criminal court war crime. I mean, we used to reserve that kind of thing for somebody. I mean, it's desperate what's going on here. And it seems to me it's because we now have a situation in which the evidence is mounting that the American empire is slipping or declining or shrinking, or at least in danger of all of that happening. People sense that, even if they couldn't put it into words, and that explains perhaps the hype that's going on, the almost desperate quality of pulling out all the stops, not caring what the longer term effects are of seizing the reserves of a country, seizing the private property of wealthy people, thinking that if you call him an oligarch, then he isn't anymore Elon Musk or Jeffrey Bezos or any of the others who are close to government because they have vast wealth. I mean, and the message it sends all over the world is extraordinary. I mean, I looked at because my family is French, I looked at the election last Sunday. They had a national election in France. Ukraine was not an issue.
Right.
The things that people in France were voting for and against had very little to do, at best tangentially. And they're close to Ukraine, right? It's a 2-hour train ride. You're in Ukraine. I mean, for them, it ought to be. It isn't at all. And nobody comments on that. Like, again, the bubble mentality. In France, all attention in the American media now is on the fact that the challenger for the sitting president, by the way, the sitting president, after being president for several years, in this election, 72% of the people who voted for someone else.
Right.
I mean, this was a statement by the French people that I don't want to be vulgar here, but they have no use for Mr. Macron. That is a stupefying rejection. Right. But worse even than not saying that, and virtually no media said it, was the fact that Marine Le Pen, a far right-wing anti-immigrant politician, she's the great challenger. She got precisely 23.1% of the vote. Right behind her, the third candidate, a man named Mélenchon, whose career I have followed, who is an active, outspoken, left-wing socialist, he got 22% of the vote, 1.1% less than Marine Le Pen. France is not a country lurching to the right. That is nonsense. If you put together the vote gotten by Mélenchon, 22%, with the vote gotten by the candidate of the Communist Party of France, right, 2.5%, you put those two together, if they had run together one candidate, they would be contesting Macron, not Le Pen.
And if you added in the pathetic performance of the French Socialist Party at what, 1.7%, 2%, right, they'd be well ahead of Marine Le Pen, right?
Right. And if you added the Green Party, they would have defeated Mr. Macron and they'd be on their way to run the society. And the notion that the left is gone or not relevant, that is craziness. It's like when, if you don't mind my saying so, RJ, when I give public talks, the little bit that we do these days, I love to use the Portuguese government. I ask my audience, well, you all know what Portugal is. Yes, everybody knows what Portugal is. How many of you have ever gone to Portugal as a tourist because they have beautiful beaches? People raise their hand, or drunk Portuguese wine or whatever. Then I say, how many of you know anything about the government in Portugal? Silence. So let me tell you, in 2016, they had an election. Unlike the United States, they believe in freedom of choice, so they have lots of political parties who put up candidates. We, of course, know that we don't need anything more than 2, which is why we only have 2. There are some titters in the audience when I do that. But then now that I tell you, no one party gets 50% of the vote, so you have to have coalition governments. You put together enough parties that together it's over 50% of the votes cast. So in 2016, a coalition government took over in Portugal, and they've governed ever since, right to this moment. The leading party is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The number 2 party in the coalition that governs is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the number 3 is the Portuguese Green Party. That's the government. They ran for re-election in 2020, and they were overwhelmingly re-elected. And you should see the audience. It's an audience of Americans who are looking at me as if they were 6-year-old children who were just informed that Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer doesn't actually exist.
Well, and I wonder if I just found out that after he mentioned the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, that one of the leading political forces after his overthrow was an Islamic communist organization called the Association of God-Fearing Socialists. So throw that into a talk. I'm sure that would people would spend a little time trying to wrap their heads around that. But Richard Wolff, as always, a very insightful and helpful viewpoint on things. So thank you so much, as always, for your thoughts. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ. And again, my hat's off to you for doing these kinds of programs. It's the kind of public discussion that we so badly, badly need.
Thank you. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.